Salvete, amici. Oh, how can he be so ignorant? Doesn't he know? Doesn't he know that it's amici and not amici? Yes, 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 I know all about that. And soon you will too. I'm Luke, and this is polýMATHY. Let's talk about the pronunciation of Latin letter C. As always, I think it's a great place to start with modern Romance languages. In European Spanish, the sound of CE or CI is the and thi. And in American Spanish, Portuguese, and French, and Catalan, it's se, si. While in Italian and Romanian, don't forget Romanian, it's che and chi. And this is how they sound also in the ecclesiastical pronunciation of Latin, also called the traditional Italian pronunciation of Latin. I'd like to take this opportunity to say that it's absolutely fine to use the ecclesiastical pronunciation of Latin as a convention for working with Latin of any period. It's just a convention. It's not historically relevant until the year 800 AD. That is to say, as a system, it does not represent the sound of Latin in antiquity, but it is a beautiful sound to pronounce Latin with, and you can check out my other videos about the topic, which are also linked in the description.
What? Are you trying to tell me,
You say from your armchair,
that every Romance language has a soft CE and CI sound, and Latin is supposed to have a hard K key sound? Impossible.
I didn't finish my review of the Romance languages. We need to travel to the Emerald Isle of Sardinia. The Sardinian language has various dialects. See my video about dialect versus language for more. And in the more conservative forms of Sardinian, all Latin CE and CI are pronounced ke, ki, which is exactly as they were in Classical Latin 2,000 years ago, which is the literary period for the authors who lived roughly from 100 BC to 200 AD. The reason that Sardinian has this in common with Classical Latin is probably because Sardinian evolved from a version of Latin which existed at around the same time period. Meanwhile, the other Romance languages underwent several changes that did not affect Sardinian. Here are some examples in Sardinian. Latin centum is centu in Sardinian. In Italian, it's cento. Latin decen is dece. In Italian, it's dieci. Latin facere is facere in Sardinian. And in Italian, it's fare. This is also true of the letter G. Latin gente is gente. In Italian, it's gente. It can also be useful to see where words come from etymologically within Latin. For example, the word accidit means it happens, and it's from ad, meaning towards, and cadit, which means falls. Adcadit, adcidit, adcidit, accidit is how that transformation happened from Old Latin into Classical Latin. And the reason that the vowel mutates, well, we'll talk about that in a different video. So subscribe if you want to hear more about that. But that's not all. The ancient Romans themselves advise us that K and Q are essentially redundant letters, since they make the exact same sound as letter C. And letter G is also identified as being similar to the sound of C. That is, G is like G, except that the latter is voiced, and the former G is unvoiced. And if you want to hear an extremely authentic and wonderful example of the sound of Classical Latin, my friend Metatron has published a new video where he talks about Roman armor in Latin. He's an Italian native speaker, which makes his Latin sound beautiful, natural, and is an outstanding exemplar worthy of imitation. Go subscribe to his channel and check out his new video because it's legendary. Te saluto, amiche. But after the classical period of Latin, there are changes. After all, how do we even get from ke to che? Let's take a closer look at how vowels work in language. This is the International Phonetic Alphabet, or IPA, vowel chart. Vowels articulated towards the front of the mouth, like e and I, are called front vowels, while those articulated towards the back, like o and u, are, you guessed it, back vowels. The sounds g and g are velar consonants, meaning they are articulated by contact of the tongue against the velum, or soft palate. When velar consonants are followed by front vowels, it's a very normal development in many languages for the sound to change from ge and ge into ge and ge. Mono-Greek is an excellent example of this, where kappa plus epsilon is pronounced ge, and gamma plus epsilon is ye. There's also been some frication, which has happened to that sound. Fascinatingly, there is solid evidence for palatal ge and ge. That's what these sounds are called because they're formed with a hard palate instead of the velum, so we call them palatal consonants ge, ke, there is solid evidence for them existing as the normal pronunciation in ancient Greek from even before we start the Roman classical period, which is why they are part of the Lucian pronunciation of ancient Greek. And see this video for more on that. While it's possible that language contact between the highly coexistent, co-evolving Latin and Greek languages of antiquity is responsible for why Latin eventually had a similar change as ancient Greek, that is in this giant Mediterranean Sprachbund, that is where languages that aren't necessarily related are affecting each other because they cohabitate in the same general geography, it's entirely possible that they evolved completely independently. When did this happen exactly, though? Well, we do have a really cool language that we can look to, which is the Albanian language. Albanian is an Indo-European language, but it's the only surviving member of its branch of Indo-European, so it's called a language isolate. I won't speculate too much about the origins of Albanian here, but I do want to talk about words that were borrowed from Latin during the time of the Roman Empire into an older form of Albanian, because Albanian words derived from Latin, in fact, still retain some of these really interesting palatal consonant sounds. For example, geni is from Latin genius, so we can imagine that there was a transition where it was genius in classical Latin, and then became not ge, but ge, palatal, not velar, genius, and then the suffix was lost, geni. And Latin gentem must have become gente, and that's what it is nearly in Albanian, where it's ginde. Latin gentum becomes Albanian kind, and ducem becomes duc. It's hard to say exactly when these words were borrowed into Albanian. It could have been very early, during the conquest of Illyricum, which happened in the 1st century AD, or it could have been much later, through the later part of the Western Roman Empire, or even after. We're really not sure, but it does add to the evidence that the transition from the velar sound of ke was becoming ke at some time during the Western Roman Empire, eventually becoming the sound che after the year 500 AD. Once ke and ge have been fronted to ke and ge, they only need to be fronted just a little bit more to become near enough to the Italian sound, and don't forget Romanian, of che and je. These sounds are called post-alveolar affricates, and the first evidence for their existence comes in the 6th century AD, when the letters q and even k are used before front vowels to indicate the value of k in non-standard spellings of late Latin, or shall we say, Proto-Romance. And from che and je, we get different developments in the other Romance languages. If you'd like to see a video where I talk about why CE, CI, and GE and GI sound the way they do in Portuguese and French and Spanish, then let me know in a comment below. But then why does Latin even have a letter K if it doesn't use it? The reason is that Latin spelling conventions are inherited largely from Etruscan. The Etruscan alphabet used letter Q before back vowels, letter C before front vowels, and letter K before the vowel sound A, which is normally classified as a back vowel but was considered sufficiently different in Etruscan. And the reason seems to be that Etruscan uses this convention is because even though the velar voiceless occlusive K sound is just a K, it has allophonic variation depending on the vowel sound that follows it in most languages. Probably this was true of Etruscan, just as it is in English. For example, if I say ku, and then I change to ka and ki, try it, kukaki, kukaki. Can you feel that the point of articulation, kukaki, kikaku, is slightly different, slightly more forward and slightly more back? This is, of course, why we have the palatalization effect from ke, ki into ke, ki in languages like modern Greek and in the Imperial Roman Latin. That is to say, the change happened in some voices, definitely during the Roman Empire. Exactly when and where and which people, we don't know, but it had to have happened given the developments in the Romance languages. The Etruscans, however, inherited a variant of the Western Greek alphabet which was much older and much more similar to the original Phoenician alphabet. And it had letters like the koppa, and that's from the Phoenician letter kop, like its equivalent in some modern Semitic languages, is for the voiceless uvular occlusive ko, ko, ko. So the Etruscans use this letter, which looks a lot like a Q, doesn't it, for the velar ku, since it was an equivalent sound. And then they used the letter K for the sound of ka, and they used the letter C in front of front vowels. The letter C is derived ultimately from the Phoenician letter gimel. Etruscan didn't have voice consonants. It didn't have a g, so it used the letter and changed its shape a bit for a different purpose, ki. In fact, when Latin adapted the Etruscan alphabet, it maintained these spelling conventions exactly for quite a while. In Old Latin, we have inscriptions like citra, caput, cura. but there was no separate letter for the voiced velar occlusive g sound, which is a native sound in Latin and many other Indo-European languages. Etruscan didn't have a g. This was a problem for a while, but around 230 BC, the Roman grammarian Spurius Carvilius Ruga, he wanted to spell his own name phonetically, I think. So he invented the letter G by adding a little tick to the letter C. Ecce littera. But in Latin to this day, we retain the letter C in some unique places, just like in classical Latin, specifically for the abbreviation of names like Gaius, as in Gaius Julius Caesar, and also Gnaeus Pompeius Magnus. The Italian name Caio, which is spelled with the letter C, is a kind of Renaissance-era hypercorrection, thinking perhaps, oh, it actually was a G, and the G is a corruption of the later form of Latin, but that's really not the case. It is Gaius with a G sound, Gaius, in ancient classical Latin. Thus, as we saw earlier, from the 1st century AD Roman grammarian Quintilian, the letter K was seen as superfluous and was hardly used at all anymore, even in front of the letter A. And as Quintilian noted, Q makes the exact same sound as the letter C, but Q is retained in Latin spelling for a specific environment, that is the QU of the sound qua, because in a word like qui, which means who or which, this is the labiovelar sound qua. It's not cui. It's not two vowels in succession. It's one consonant plus one vowel. Qua, the voiceless labiovelar occlusive. The way that QU is pronounced in Latin, though, is slightly different than it's pronounced in Italian and English. In English, we have the word quest, and in Italian, we have questo. And in both of these languages, it's a succession of two consonant sounds. Ca, wa, qua, qua. Italian questo is different, for example, quintilianus, or qui. In these words, it's a labiovelar sound, and that means that we articulate the U part, the W, at the exact same time as we make the G sound, so qua, qua, qua. It's not qua, 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 which is the normal pronunciation in Italian and English of a QU. It's a subtle distinction, but a kind of important one in order to appreciate Latin literature, especially its poetry, where the distinction plays a huge part. And for more on that, see my playlist all about the pronunciation of Latin poetry. If you find this topic interesting, y si ustedes hablan español, or you can read English subtitles, I strongly recommend my friend Linguriosa's channel. She talks all about very similar topics like this. It is absolutely fascinating. Subscribe to her channel. You won't be disappointed. Thanks so much for watching and subscribing. Valete, amici. That is to say, this